And isn't it so fitting that Zelensky opened up the New York Stock Exchange, announcing also this? It would have been one thing if it was just a political statement, right? If it was just, look at me, I'm the so-called Democratic leader that you're all supporting, and thank you for your support. But no, there was a whole agenda laid out that was obviously given to him by those very forces at the New York Stock Exchange. And it's just so fitting. And I think one thing that often isn't considered, even for those who talk about multipolarity and this shift in global relations, is everything you're saying about the global neoliberal order is being countered by those forces who are trying to chart a different path, who are trying to chart a multipolar world. Because across the board, this includes Russia. And I want to make a note about what you said about Ukraine sending everyone to die, conscripting, treating this like an out and out war. Russia's not doing that. Russia is limiting its soldiers. It does not have forced conscription. It is not sending all troops down the line, all of its civilians into harm's way. There's a different approach here. This is a battle to the last Ukrainian, and it's the West in Ukraine that's actually spurring that. But, and of course, we can get into the fact that a peace deal was killed. We already know one time back in April that you also covered. So, but I want you to comment anything there, and also comment on this idea of neoliberalism being challenged by multipolarity, because not Russia, not China, not any of the countries in Latin America, Africa, Asia, none of them are asking for these kind of concessions. None of them are saying, if we're going to trade with you, you have to open up all of your state assets and basically give it to all of our private shareholders. They're not doing that. So what is this difference, and why is it not being talked about in this way?
Well, yeah, on this is why I keep citing the economist Michael Hudson, because I think if people really want to understand what neoliberalism is, they should study his work, read his books, check out his articles and interviews. I mean, because he has really influenced my understanding that neoliberalism is inextricably tied to U.S. foreign policy and U.S. imperialism. Again, it is the phase of capitalism that we've been living in since the 1980s of U.S. unipolar hegemony, when there were no systemic alternatives challenging U.S. imperialism. And just as at the peak of the British Empire imposed so-called free trade and the free market on the colonies and on countries where it was dominating. I mean, this is how imperialism, the economics of imperialism functions. I mean, we can talk about, of course, the blunt neo-colonial force of the U.S. war machine, right? The military simply invading countries, overthrowing their elected governments. Clearly, I mean, that's one arm of imperialism. But there's also the economic form of imperialism that sometimes can be a little more subtle in the sense that it's not as clearly obvious as the U.S. bombing a country, right? But sanctions kill just as many people as bombs, right? And these neoliberal policies and these structural adjustment policies imposed on countries often kill just as many people as military wars, as conventional wars. And we've seen, for instance, that just as the British Empire forced so-called free trade on colonies, like India, parts of Africa, parts of Latin America, it forced them to open their borders, to drop all tariffs, to make their goods, completely uncompetitive with the British subsidized goods. So the British Empire would flood the colony with British textiles, for instance, in the case of India, and Indian textile workers couldn't compete because the British textiles were subsidized by the British state. But the Indian state, which was a puppet regime of the British Empire, was not allowed to subsidize its own domestic textile industry, which means that the domestic textile industry was destroyed, and it forced all of these workers out of their jobs to be exploited, right? This is exactly what the U.S. empire does. We can see it in places like Haiti, where the U.S. destroyed the Haitian agricultural sector and then flooded Haiti with extremely low quality rice that was subsidized by the U.S. to destroy Haitian agriculture, to make Haiti dependent on U.S. agriculture, to make the people dependent on the U.S. empire so they can't be independent. A key part of the economics of imperialism is destroying food sovereignty in nations, destroying local agriculture, and making that country dependent on the U.S. agricultural sector, which is subsidized by the state, as a form of blackmail to control a country by controlling them through their food supply. We saw that NAFTA, this neoliberal free trade agreement, signed in 1994, that did the same thing to the Mexican agricultural sector, pushing millions of Mexican agricultural workers off their land so large U.S. big ag corporations could monopolize the agricultural sector. We're now seeing the same exact process happen to Ukraine. This is how neoliberalism functions. It's not, and this is how capitalism functions, but especially in the financialized neoliberal era. It's not about development. It's about de-development. It's about extraction of resources, super exploitation of labor. It's not about developing these countries. And you raise such a key point, Danny. China in particular offers a separate model of development that is actually based on development, state-led socialist development. In China, all of the land is owned by the state, all of it. In China, the commanding heights of the economy are owned by the state, which is governed by a communist party. In China, the 40% of the GDP comes from state-owned companies, construction companies, infrastructure companies, communications, telecommunications run by the state on behalf of the people, right? All of transportation, right? So yeah, not everything is nationalized like in the Soviet Union. It's a slightly different model. We can talk about the differences, but the reality is that China offers a fundamentally distinct model. It is in no way similar to the neoliberal model that the US empire has been imposing in the world for over 30 years now. And even Russia, which does not have a socialist model, it has an industrial capitalist model with significant state leadership in the economy. A large percentage of GDP in Russia comes from state-owned companies. The estimates are between 30 to 40%. And the largest companies in Russia are state-owned. Gazprom, which is the largest company in all of Russia, it's the gas giant, that is. The gas is owned by the state, and Gazprom is used to fund state revenue. We also see that oil and other natural resources are owned by the state. The largest banks are owned by the state, like Sberbank. So yes, Russia doesn't have the same kind of socialist model that it had in the Soviet Union or China does, but it is not the same as the US and European neoliberal model that the US empire is trying to impose on the world. That's the main reason, honestly, along with the independent foreign policy of the Russian Federation. That's the main reason why the US empire and US capitalists have been so desperate to try to overthrow the Russian government. It's not even really about Putin, right? I mean, Putin, when he first came in, he was brought in to the U.S. thought he was going to be a more effective manager of Russian capitalism than the alcoholic U.S. puppet Boris Yeltsin that they installed. And then at first, Putin thought that Russia could maybe be integrated into the West in this world system, and the West refused to have it. And Putin refused to subjugate his country and turn his country into a Western colony. He said that very many times. He said, we wanted to integrate with the West, and they refused to have us on equal terms. They only want us to be a colony. So he was forced to create a separate model of economic development, not because he's ideologically a socialist, but to prevent his country from being cannibalized by Western capital. And this is exactly why the U.S. is so desperate to overthrow the Russian government. It wants to reprivatize all of the oil and all of the gas and the huge mineral reserves and gold and other significant natural resources that Russia has. All of that was privatized in the 1990s. It has slowly been renationalized by the Russian state, and then that revenue is used to fund social services in Russia. So that we're talking about a fundamental difference between the financialized neoliberal capitalist model that the US and Europe are trying to impose on the world and the socialist state-led model in China and the state-led, industrial capitalist model in Russia. So yes, China and Russia have differences, but they have more in common economically and politically than the neoliberal West. So the first Cold War was a class war. The first Cold War that ended in 1991 was a war between capitalism and socialism. The Soviet Union was the leader of the socialist bloc. The United States was the leader of the capitalist bloc. After the overthrow of the Soviet Union and counter-revolution in much of the world, the first Cold War ended and capitalism won. Neoliberalism was imposed on the world. Well, slowly countries, especially in the global South, have been trying to free themselves from neoliberalism. And now we see the new Cold War. And the second Cold War, like the first Cold War, is also a class war. And it is a war between different systems. It is a war between neoliberal financialized capitalism and state-led national development of the economy on behalf of the country and not just financial capital.